welcome to the lunchtime panel here. My name is Madeline Carr. I'm a senior lecturer at Cardiff University in the UK, and I work on international relations and the internet, on issues of cybersecurity and internet governance. I wanted to just start, of course, by thanking the organizers, Catherine Lautriante and the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. But I also just wanted to mention our colleague Anakin Ringus, who really was in many ways kind of the intellectual impetus behind this panel, but unfortunately couldn't be here due to another engagement. So she asked me to step in as the moderator of the panel, which I'm very happy to do so. What I wanted to do in this session was just first begin with just some kind of framing comments to try and bring us all together onto the same page with what we're trying to do today, and then we'll follow the standard format. Each person here has a presentation, and then we'll open up into a discussion in the room to see how we can move forward. Now, I mean, I guess, you know, Catherine noted this morning, and so many other people have today and in the past, that this issue of cybersecurity brings together people from different backgrounds, different disciplines, the public sector, the private sector, the military, civil society, legal scholars, and obviously computer science, information security, and that makes for these really rich and diverse conversations that we have around these issues. But it occurred to me, I was speaking to someone last night who said to me that they had read the abstract for this panel and they didn't know what it meant. And it occurred to me that when we get together like this, we very often kind of slip into our own jargon and our own acronyms and our own frameworks of reference, and we forget that we're communicating across sectors and across disciplines. So I was really glad that person said that to me last night, and I thought I'm going to just take a few moments to set the scene. Why are we here talking about accountability, and what's the purpose of the panel? So, I mean, if this is your background, then forgive me, and if it's not, I hope I can make things a little bit more clear. I'm just going to take a few minutes. One of the really interesting and defining features of international relations is this concept that it's anarchic, right? And that there is no global government and no global policeman. And that somehow we kind of muddle along together with nobody really in charge once we go above a national level. So we have a government at that level, but once we go above that, there's really no one in charge, and we have to kind of negotiate and compromise. Back in the 1970s, there was an Australian scholar, Hedley Bull, who wrote this book called The Anarchical Society. He's an international relations scholar, and it was a play on words, this book, because he was acknowledging the anarchic society, the anarchic nature of international relations, but he was saying, but even still, there is this element of society. There are these elements of social interaction. It's not just this kind of you know, world of killing one another and taking each other's belongings. And so these social processes that we're going to talk about today, they're often a real focus for IR scholars. These are one of the things that we like to look at in this anarchical society. How do states navigate these social processes and work together? So one of the big challenges of global cybersecurity has been accountability. And we've had some really constructive debates about the applicability of law in cyberspace. It was touched on quite a bit this morning. Debates that are ongoing, but that I think, you know, most people would agree are making some progress. And we've also had some success with global negotiations about norms, norms in cyberspace, by which we mean, well, there are different meanings to that, actually. But in international relations, we mean terms of agreed behavior that we somehow agree is responsible state behavior. But even if we can agree on international law, even if we can agree on some norms or some rules of the road, as people sometimes call these, how do we actually hold each other accountable? How do we actually determine whether we're abiding by those agreements or those norms? And what do we do if we're not doing that? Now, the difficulties of attribution obviously introduce this really unusual and very interesting challenge to international relations, because IR is largely premised on behavior between identifiable actors. Doesn't mean they always obey the rules, it doesn't mean they're always states, but more or less, when we talk about international relations for the history of the discipline, we've been basically talking about actors that we can identify. Of course, covert operations have always been a factor, but by and large, international relations is about actors that we know who they are, we know who one another is. And so the problems of attribution in cyberspace introduce this whole fascinating dimension about what happens then to international relations when we're not entirely sure who's doing what. And we've seen two interesting developments here, I think. One is this point that some states are making, that allegations are being made against them about suggesting that they're undertaking malicious behavior in cyberspace without substantiation or without providing evidence. Right? So some states are saying, if you're going to make allegations about us and about our behavior, then substantiate them. No more of this just saying, we know, but we can't say. But then, of course, there's the other side to that, where even when attribution, or we understand that attribution has been possible, states very often still feel that they cannot reveal evidence about that because it would undermine their forensic or investigatory capabilities, and it would be less profitable in the long run to reveal how they know what they know than to come out in the open with it. So it's a very difficult kind of matrix of interests and capabilities at play there. And it's within this context that we see these continuing development of attempts to utilize cyber insecurities for political as well as economic purposes. And when it's difficult to either conclusively attribute malicious behavior, or at least it's not possible to reveal proof of attribution, then how do we move forward with holding state and non-state actors accountable? How do we do that? How do we navigate this kind of social relationship to develop more predictability about international relations in the information age? And this is kind of the big question that animates this panel. Now, accountability doesn't lead to compliance, and it doesn't lead to enforcement, and that's the anarchic part of international relations. I think Joseph and I, referred to that in his panel on cyber norms this morning. He made that point really clear. But just because, and James Lewis also made this point, just because these ideas don't lead to enforcement or to compliance, it doesn't mean that they're not important, because these are all part of the social relations that make up international relations. Accountability is an important part of global politics, where state actors encounter one another in these social negotiations about responsible state behavior in cyberspace. Now, what we're hoping to do with this panel is sometimes these ideas about international relations just become so abstract and so difficult to kind of pin down and move forward with, that what we thought it would be useful to do is kind of turn to practices, to actual practices that take place and that are sort of sites where we can see accountability happening. And we can see practices and processes and structures in place for improving accountability. Because sometimes when we look at things like that, we can extrapolate to an international level. Sometimes we can't. And it may be that at the end of this panel we feel, even after the 4 fascinating presentations that there's nothing that we can see that we could easily take up to the international level, but I don't think so. I think that when we look at these practices, we might start to think, well, that's an interesting element that we could consider in the international space. So the intent of this panel is to have this sort of quite pragmatic and experience-based conversation about what drives accountability between various actors, the public and private sectors across borders, the board members and their shareholders. Lots of very interesting sites that we want to look at, and then to just kind of put to one side for a minute these sort of high politics question and look at responsible behavior sort of quite pragmatically at this level, and ideally, hopefully this will provide some ideas about how we can move forward. So I hope that's gone some way to address the lack of clarity in the abstract, and I hope it's kind of clear now what we're going to do. We've got 4 really fascinating presenters who are going to come at this from very different perspectives, and while their own stories in themselves I think are all absolutely fascinating, I think also they're going to build together to this sort of bigger picture that we can start to think about what do we do in international relations with the problem of accountability. So we're going to go in the order of the program and the order that the speakers are sitting. I'll turn over first to Florida Kabasinga, who is a managing partner at Certa Law in Rwanda. Florida?
Thank you, Madeline. In order to understand what it means to have a stable cyberspace, we need to understand what the risks are in order to understand what stable cyberspace is. To begin with, it's the new frontier with which I think we're going to have very many problems. It's a common area similar to what they call now the global commons, similar to the sea and space, and it's limitless. So the risks are immense, and the potentials for malice are extremely immense. So it's in everybody's interest to work towards a stable cyberspace where the participants are actually feel less threatened by cyber attacks and cyber malice and cyber warfare and all hacktivism and this kind of thing. So I come from a country which is really does not have a lot of natural resources. So it has put ICTs as a main key factor in development. So when you talk about sustainable development goals, when you talk about millennium goals that were before that, when you talk about regional development, ICT is a big issue in Rwanda now. Everything is going electronic. If you want access to government services, if you want to do anything, pay for any government service, everything is becoming electronic. And so the potential for attacks on the cyber assets of Rwanda or everybody else who takes ICTs as a major factor in their development is really immense. And it's in everybody's interest to work towards a stable cyberspace. So in Rwanda, there's a clear framework for the ICTs. You have the National CSAT, which is based in the Rwanda Development Board. Like I said, ICTs are part of the development agenda of Rwanda. So it's not surprising that you have the mechanisms for protection being based at the Rwanda Development Board. So in order to work towards a stable cyberspace, first of all, you need to put in place mechanisms to secure cyberspace. But as Madeline said, obviously some of the cyber attacks and hacktivism and all these things, the malice, some of it goes through. So how do you work through that after it has already gone through? So in that regard, we have legal frameworks that are supposed to deal with this. However, in Rwanda, you do have laws that are scattered. You have laws against attacks on electronic transactions. You have some in the penal code. You have some in different scattered laws. However, there's a bill now that has been put in place called the ICT bill that is supposed to be used as a central tool to fight cyber malice, but it has not yet gone through. And then you have regional mechanisms. I think what we said is that you start at the national level, and then you go regional, and then you go international, because it's limitless what can be done with cyber. So you have the East African Community Organization, which is EACO. They have a framework within which to deal with cybersecurity issues. And then you have the African Convention on Cybersecurity, which was signed in 2014, and Rwanda is part of it. And however, you have to have international cooperation on these matters. Madeline spoke about states and how they deal with each other, but also you have individual malice as well. So when it comes to that, you go into another even more murkier situation of seeking mutual legal assistance from country to country, which is very difficult since now the laws on cyber are very different in each country from country to country. And when you go through mutual legal assistance, you have to ask to request for individuals to be investigated when the crime in that country where you're investigating is actually also, that very crime is criminalized. So it becomes a big issue when you go through MLS for individual ones. So I'll end there by saying that you have to have a clear legal framework, and you also have to have clear institutional framework, national and regionally, and then internationally, in order to work towards a stable cyberspace.
Thank you, Florida. Saif?
Thank you very much, Madeline. And it's a pleasure to be here, part of the conference and part of this panel. So I'd like to start by just giving a little bit of background about the country I come from, the United Arab Emirates, just to put things into perspective for those that don't know much about the UAE. The UAE is a fairly young nation. We just celebrated our 44th year a couple of months ago. And it is a country that relies tremendously on ICT. Our leadership has made ICT and innovation and the use of technology one of our priorities in our national agenda. And we've recently focused on developing smart cities. We have among the highest rates of smart government services on mobile devices, and the typical services you find in other countries like e-banking, government paying for your bills, government electricity bills, and things like that. So we have an extremely high reliance on ICT, and we're going to continue focusing and developing our utilization of ICT going forward. So, having said that, our leadership established the National Electronic Security Authority in 2012. So we're a fairly young organization. It was established mainly to take the national role of cyber and electronic security across the country. So our focus is, how do we make sure that we have the right national strategy? How do we make sure that we have the right policies and the right standards to protect our government and our critical infrastructure from cyber attacks? So cybersecurity became high on our country's agenda. So since the establishment of NISA, we have published our national cybersecurity strategy, which basically sets the roadmap for the country and the direction for our cybersecurity at a national level. In addition to the strategy, we published several policies and frameworks. I'm not going to go into the details of these, but one of which is our National Information Assurance Framework, which clearly defines roles and responsibilities at a national and at a sectorial level and at an entity level. The concept of defining roles and responsibilities is extremely important in assigning accountability to different stakeholders within the country and within organizations. So we came up with this framework, which clearly defines who's responsible for what. And we came up with our National Information Assurance standards. And our standards basically set the minimum that all government and critical infrastructure operators in the country need to meet in order to be compliant with our standards. So having a clear, let's say, threshold that all organizations and critical infrastructure operators is extremely important from an accountability point of view. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about is, from a national point of view, what are our shared values at a national level, and what goals have we set within the UAE in order to improve our cybersecurity posture, and at the end of the day, improve clarity of accountability within the country. So in order to like I said, our first goal was to set the minimum. So generally improving the cybersecurity posture across the country to make sure that everybody knows what's expected from each government and critical infrastructure operator. We also are focusing on awareness and capability building. So in order to meet those standards and to have good cybersecurity postures within all of these organizations, we need to make sure that we have the right workforce. So having clear roadmap for each organization to make sure that there's a person, chief information security officer or an information security manager that is focused on cybersecurity was one of our priorities. So as part of that initiative, we launched our cybersecurity capability building strategy, which basically we work with the different government and critical operators in the country, as well as work with academia. Our goal was to make sure that there was a dialogue between these operators that have a demand for information security experts and academia, which are graduating experts in these areas. So we wanted to make sure that there was clear dialogue, there were clear programs, and we also wanted to make sure that academia is aware that there's also a responsibility and a burden on them to make sure that they meet these numbers. So we need to make sure that there's a pipeline of qualified information security experts to eventually work in these organizations. We also focused, and we're currently focusing our national awareness campaigns on shared responsibility. So we always talk about cybersecurity not being the responsibility of a country, of an organization, of an information security manager in that organization, but it's a shared responsibility. It's a shared responsibility of each and every user of ICT in the country. We also focus on the concept of inclusiveness. So including different individuals in the dialogue also ensures that they are on board and they are contributing to the development of our future plans at a national level. So from an engagement point of view, the National Electronic Security Authority established several working groups that cover all of the different critical infrastructure sectors in the country. So this allows us to co-chair these working groups with a regulator, if there is a regulator in the sector, and allows all of the different entities in critical infrastructure to participate in these working groups. They work with us hand in hand in developing sector-specific policies and sector-specific standards. At the end of the day, we are not experts in all of these different areas and these different sectors, so we ensure on the subject matter experts from the different sectors to participate. So this concept of inclusiveness and being able to contribute to our national regulations also instills a sense of accountability within all of these sectors and these individuals. Additionally, we're focusing on building a common risk register within those working groups. So each entity develops their own risk register, which basically compiles into a sectorial risk register and eventually a national risk register. So we're able to share that national, sectorial, and entity view. And like I said, everybody contributes and feels they're a part of the process and they're aware of what risks exist. Lastly, it's a platform for us to hear them out. Everybody has a voice, everybody is within those working groups is able to shape the direction in which we take that specific work group and the regulations and the policies and standards that come out from that working group. The next thing is information sharing. Again, the importance of sharing information. We heard a lot about that this morning. We are creating a secure environment in which organizations are able to share information. At the end of the day, everybody is also accountable. If there is a vulnerability within a specific sector, they need to be able to share that information in a secure manner to enable others within that sector to benefit and respond and react to that vulnerability. Lastly, we're focusing very much on the future generation. So inclusiveness from a awareness and an outreach point of view. We have several initiatives at a national level where we're doing cyber competitions, capture the flag type competitions, to create more interest and more excitement in not only in cybersecurity but also in STEM areas. So we're focusing a lot on making sure that we have the next generation. Now, lastly, I think we heard a lot about establishing international norms, and I agree with what has been talked about. We need to focus on norms. Treaties haven't worked very well so far. And we need to focus on starting small, so having different regional, so as Florida mentioned earlier, regional work groups that work together and establish norms and agree upon them and eventually come together at an international community. So we need to take small steps towards agreeing and having a global international norm. And basically our end goal is to have clear rights and duties in a global manner when it comes to cybersecurity and who's responsible for what. Thank you.
Thank you, Saif. And yeah, just for any of you who are interested in those issues, I'd really encourage you to take a look at the UAE's document, because it has been critically reviewed by the security sector very favorably as a a model of best practice, basically. So it's worth delving into. Simone.
Thank you all for having me here today. In addressing accountability, I want to diverge a little bit from the government and nation state perspective and spend a little bit time on the private sector and some of the behaviors and approaches that are taken and some of the things that I think are not only best practices for how economic incentives can be put in place, but also the ways that that can work with some of the government norms that can be established or may already be established. By way of background, I'm part of CyberVista, and we're a cyber education and workforce training company, but we spend quite a bit of our time speaking with board members and executives about ultimately what are the enterprise risks that face them in their businesses. And in many cases, those are very similar conversations to what world leaders and agencies and organizations also have to consider in their own security and postures. And when we start talking about a stable cyberspace and how you can make that happen, a lot of the issues ultimately boil down to how do we approach enterprise risk. And from an accountability perspective, the private sector really looks at everything through this lens. And what is their enterprise risk? Well, it's very simple. It's essentially the threats that they have to their organizations, the vulnerabilities that exist within their organizations, and then the potential impacts that those threats and vulnerabilities could have on their systems, their operations, or their business around the globe. And so when you start looking at that, and how do you actually reduce the overall risk posture? What things or what levers can you pull in each of those areas to start to reduce that overall risk? And from a private sector perspective, it really ultimately boils down to two main areas. The first is around your internal considerations. So these are essentially the things you can control. They exist within your own organization. It's your internal security posture. It's hardening your perimeters. It's being resilient as possible, having the right workforce, and making sure that they're trained and up to date. But it's also around, around the incentive and goal of protecting your core business and protecting your strategy for the growth of that business. So that's where that might diverge. But at the end of the day, it is about protecting that core. And the steps that end up being taken are around ensuring you have your brand protection, protecting your customers, ensuring that your systems have confidentiality, integrity and availability, because your business is contingent upon being able to provide those things to your consumers. And so what are the things that you can do internally to control each of those levers? Well, you can't control what the external threat is. You can take potential steps to be more informed about it and be educated on what the landscape is looking like. And the other thing that I think is very important for the private sector to consider when they start talking about, well, what is my threat or what are my vulnerabilities? And this is very similar in my perspective to what you see in agencies and governments, is a understanding of what is the most valuable asset to your operation. And a critical thing that often gets left off the table is that every business, every organization, every agency, and every nation state is ultimately an information business or an information agency. And so information is ultimately the most valuable asset. And what we now do to protect those things are what we actually can control as far as what we collect and how we do collect it. Where do we segment it? Do we protect it? Do we keep certain encryptions in place? Do we control access to those things? Again, these are all internal things that we as a private sector entity can take care of in protecting our own assets. And there is an economic incentive for the private sector to do so. Just by way of an anecdote, in a previous life, I worked with a number of financial and retail clients, and we talk about the incentives for them to put their security operations into place. And what we found is that the biggest internal issue they had was setting their own incentives to determine why they should have more security. So it wasn't even necessarily about how much you're going to invest. That's certainly an area that's of big concern in the private sector, is what is that ROI? But what are also the incentives to compel people to work together within a business organization for overall security? And oftentimes the risk folks that are responsible for evaluating risk are separate than the security folks. And sometimes their actual incentives for progression and promotion within the company were tied to incentives that actually were inherently dichotomous to the overall objective. And so really, from an internal perspective, it's not only all of those traditional security measures, but aligning those incentives with yourselves internally. The second thing when you think about that overall enterprise risk and how that potentially impacts things are the external considerations. So these are the things that you can't control, or if you can control them, it's to a fairly limited degree. And in the private sector, I think the largest issue that really impacts businesses when they're thinking about, especially in the international space, is around their supply chains and their third-party providers. And what does that overall attack surface start to look like? Well, right now, there are lots of best practices. The United States has guidance that came out from the FTC that says, well, ensure that any third-party providers, whether they're international or domestic, have some sort of assurances in place, whether contractually or otherwise, that they're following security procedures. Well, that's a fairly limited enforcement mechanism to just say, we'll make sure that there's some assurances in the contract that they're going to be following security measures. At the end of the day, businesses don't have a lot of confidence that who they do business with, whether it's looking to open an international office or a supplier that they're using offshore or onshore, or in some cases even their own law firms that are holding significant amounts of their proprietary information, are actually secure in the way they're handling this information, and thus create a potential mechanism for these businesses to also be at risk. So when we start talking about norms and kind of how you take a lot of the private and public sector partnerships and how do they work together, one of the things that I have seen that is a huge issue for businesses is what are the best practices or what are the norms or treaties as far as expectations that should be happening in some of these international engagements. And the more that the international community and the US can start to work together to say this is what these touch points should look like when you start talking about mergers and acquisitions or a actual relationship with a potential supplier, there really isn't any firm guidance that provides concrete evidence of what that landscape should look like. And so, we sit there and say, well, here are the things we can control internally, here are the things we can control externally, but what can we do about it? And from the private perspective, the private sector perspective, it really all boils down to culture and a culture of security. And I see this more as a mindset issue than I do any particular treaty or legal or normative operation. And a lot of that comes down from the leadership. So in the private sector, whether it's a board of directors or the executive team, in a country, whether it's actually the leadership or the agencies that are charged with national security and also cybersecurity, it's instilling that culture of security across the entire organization and down the entire organization. And ultimately, that starts with education. If you are not educated as a leader, whether it's in the private sector running a business or a multinational corporation, or whether at a NGO or other nation state, if you are not educated on how cybersecurity affects or impacts your enterprise risk, then any other measures you put in place cannot be effective because you're not going to be informed enough to make those right decisions. And so at the end of the day, it's about tying all of those cyber risks into those existing enterprise risks. Leaders in companies, leaders at nations understand how to manage risk. It is what they do every day. And right now we have a mindset that cyber is something new, it's something different, it's something technical that we don't understand. But it's actually just one component that can now impact all those other areas of risks we're already really familiar with. So businesses care a lot about operating or managing their financial risk. You still have to manage your financial risk, but cyber could potentially impact that, because if I'm a financial institution and my business is contingent upon the markets running every day, and there's a denial of service and I now no longer have access to those markets, that's a cyber event, but I have a financial impact. So I think there's a mindset component that we need to get out of. This is its own category of risk, and it's actually just something that impacts your operations, your financial, your reputation, and in some cases even your physical risk. And again, that comes down to the education of those leaders making those decisions. And from a private sector perspective, when we think about public and private information sharing, those are great passive incentives to put in place for the private sector to start to take initiatives to increase their overall security. But there need to be more overt incentives kind of put in place for those things to take effect and really have an impact. And I don't mean that to say that there should be some prescriptive laws or norms or treaties that become too hampering, but there do need to be guidelines set. And I do think the private sector needs to be incorporated into this dialogue as they're getting created, so that those who are setting those norms can actually take into account what are the interests from an economic perspective that the private sector needs to consider when they're actually looking at this issue. And so to close, my last point would be that the rule makers themselves, whether it's through some international coalitions, alliances, or treaties, or even just unestablished or normative conventions, those rulemakers themselves need to be educated on what are the impacts from an economic private sector perspective, a national security or critical infrastructure perspective, and then a societal, as humans, what are the safety and security measures that we need to have in place. And by having that dialogue first and understanding where everyone's coming from at the table, I think then we can really start to dive down into understanding the threat landscape, what are the actual vulnerabilities to each of those sectors and particular industries, evaluate the impacts, and really then have an understanding of the risk to make it a little bit less of the big, scary new cyber thing.
Thank you. That was so interesting, Simone. I think it's really valuable when we're talking about something like this in a more or less a national security or global security perspective, to have someone who can speak very honestly about private sector interests, because there's very often this assumption about the public-private partnership that there's a confluence of interests there, when clearly, there isn't always. And it was interesting to hear what you said, Simone, about, well, it just resonated with what Melissa Hathaway was saying this morning about let's keep the economic and the security interest, they both have to be kind of moving together. And from a private sector perspective, of course, absolutely. And the question you asked about, well, why should we have more security? Of course they're asking that question, and they have to, in a way. That's their responsibility, isn't it, to their shareholders? It also reminded me of Bruce Schneier's line on understanding risk in the private sector, that the human factor, that people don't understand risk. They don't understand the risk of poor passwords or poor cyber hygiene practices. And he said, well, actually, they understand the risk very well. They understand the risk of not getting their work done on time. They understand the risk of being too, pedantic about these things, and they understand the risk of, putting their job in jeopardy, and they make that decision. They make that calculated decision. So, was it just really interesting to hear that, and particularly because you kind of sit in between them. So now we have Ambassador Pia Rantala-Engberg, who is the ambassador for cyber affairs from Finland, and she's gonna tell us a little bit about their experience there.
Well, thank you, Madeline, so much for guiding us here with this discussion, and I'm very happy to participate in this conference or seminar. If you allow me, I would start with a small anecdote. As I last September took over my present position as Finland's cyber ambassador in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with a background of 30 years career diplomat working in the ministry and abroad, I bumped into a lot of colleagues in the corridors of the foreign ministry and asking, Pia, we didn't know that you are technically so talented. And I was wondering, what is this? I'm me technically talented? And I started really to think about it. Should I know something about computers and programming and how to code? And then, lucky as I was, I saw an article in a Finnish biggest newspaper making an advertisement for a fairy tale book about coding. And this is it. Hello, Ruby. And I bought it, and I read it 3 times, and I got a clue what coding is. So it's never too late, to learn things. But as I have been asked to talk how my country, Finland, relates to stable cyberspace, at the outset, one can say that Finland has is very well known as very digitalized country, and digitalization has been for many years now a priority for our government. Finland is also widely known as a country with a very strong ICT sector. Nokia, everybody knows. And of course, in the footsteps of Nokia grew a lot of companies who are really specialized in cybersecurity. But lately, putting the economic side a bit aside, lately also cyber issues have become an issue in the foreign and security policy agenda of my country. And as a concrete example of that is the establishment of a position of cyber ambassador in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and I'm very happy to have this position, and I really do see that there is room for a diplomat, for a career diplomat, to work with these issues. Before turning to a concrete description of our national approach and action, I would like to emphasize Finland's thinking from a broader perspective, from international perspective, and referring actually to the 2 latter questions which were posed to us panelists. Of course, it's needless to say that not a single country, not a single actor, not a single company, nor a person can work in the cyberspace in isolation. And we need constant interaction and cooperation. But at the same time, we also need this bigger picture. I think we should approach the cyberspace-related issues from a strategic perspective. It is, of course, useful to reflect the issues from down to top, to look at the issues from a technical and technological perspective. Cyber is, unfortunately, very often also understood only as a technical issue. And I very much agree here that cyber is really so much more. It's about high politics, it's about interdependencies, And it's about working together in the globalized world. And it's about cooperation and willingness to tackle together the challenges with regard to internet safety and cybersecurity. It's about cyber defense. It's about confidence building measures, as we have heard this morning. It's about law and norms. It's about capacity building in developing countries. It's about making full use of digitalization in the markets, working together with the private companies. And I also want to underline the following, that we need to safeguard together the open and free and secure internet. The internet should be protected and nurtured as a global public good. Our economies and societies depend so much on free flow of information and free access to information. And I would actually use the UNESCO's new guiding concept when they speak about internet universality, that must be our target. So it's about human rights, including freedom of opinion, expression, freedom of assembly, association, and right of privacy, as we have underlined in our debates already this morning. So all human rights must apply online as they do offline. And also another principle what Finland really in the international context and also in the national context wants to underline is the multi-stakeholder approach. So working all together, states, companies, academia, NGOs, individuals, we all have a responsibility, and this means inclusiveness, and without which we really can't build a stable and sustainable digital environment, the cyberspace. Of course, when we speak about international relations, it is needless to say that Finland wants to be an active participant in the work of cyber issues on all international fora, be it UN, be it NATO, be it EU, OECD, Council of Europe. And of course, what is also important is to work in the regional context, in smaller country groups, and I mean, there have been many times now mentioned now, for example, the work what has been done in the OSCE with the confidence building measures, and Finland has been part, of course, of that work as well. Or in the Nordic context, we have a very close cooperation, for example, with our Certs, who really pay a lot of attention to a deepened, ever deepened cooperation. Of course, I mean, as a small country, we, of course, I mean, from our very good own experience, we encourage all the other regional groupings also to take this advantage and really have this active dialogue, not only on the international level, but also regionally. But now I will come to Finland's approach, and you might be interested in hearing how we nationally tackle the issues related to cyber. And here I am now concentrating actually mainly on cyber security and how does my country prepare itself for a possible threats facing her. Of course, I mean, it's important that each and every country has its home base in order, also with cybersecurity, because cyberspace is as secure as its weakest link. So I think we all have the responsibility to do our homework, and we have tried to do it. We have chosen a concept of comprehensive security, a concept or approach which means that society's vital functions are secured through close collaboration between the authorities, business community, organizations and citizens. And this interagency and intersocietal cooperation still respects clear own responsibilities of each and every actor. But this approach is also now the backbone also for Finland's cybersecurity strategy adopted 3 years ago. The action plan, the cybersecurity then was followed quite quickly with an action plan with some 70 actions, so to speak. And now we are in the process of reviewing and revising these action plans, and we have also introduced the debate that already after 3 years, should we also review our whole strategy, because the world around us is changing so quickly. But now in the first phase, we look at the action lines. But to face all these possible scenarios and to be prepared to mobilize our whole society to tackle the security issues, we have established a so-called security committee, which assists the government and ministers in matters pertaining to comprehensive security issues, also including cyber. And the security committee follows the development of the whole Finnish society, and its security environment as well, and coordinates proactive preparedness measures. And the committee comprises of 19 members and 3 experts from a number of administrative sectors, authorities and business community, and even sometimes NGOs. So it's actually composed of the highest officials, each and every ministry, a civil servant, and the chief of defense, chief of customs, chief of police, all these instances who are responsible for the society's stability. And they come to meetings regularly, and they tackle the issues and try to they are provided with accurate picture of the security. And they have we have identified several vital functions which the committee should look at all the time to have in their radar screen. And that is the management of government affairs, international activity, internal security, Finland's defense capacity or capability, society's prosperity capability to functioning of economic and infrastructure, and also very importantly, psychological crisis tolerance. Because if we face a situation where our societies are threatened, it is of utmost importance that our people are also, with their mindset, provided with resilience. So securing these vital functions can easily be described as a network of strategic actions. And what we have done in a concrete manner, what have been the outcomes of our strategy. So we have established our Cybersecurity Center. We have further developed our CERT functions, which already, of course, existed many years before the strategy was established. We have also established a Center for Cybercrime of the police. And we of course try to enhance education and research. We scrutinize our legislation all the time to have it accurate, and of course constantly aim to develop our capabilities. But this is not self-evident that everything, when it once set up, that is enough. It needs constant revisiting, constant work, constant dialogue, and that's why this comprehensive approach is so vital. That we don't just let loose and sit there and lean backwards and everything is now done. It's never done. It's never ready, especially when we have the cyberspace around us. And then I would like to come back also very shortly on the public-private partnerships. Finland has a long tradition working very closely together with the private companies, which dates back actually from our history. I don't go into the details here now. But as in many countries, also in Finland, private companies provide really the biggest bulk of our critical infrastructure. And for that reason, it is of crucial importance that the close cooperation and the dialogue is there. And of course, the business community is also, needless to say, central player as partner in creating better situational awareness. They are the ones who take care of building up our capacities. So the confidentiality in the relationship between state actor and the private companies. As already has been mentioned so many times during already this morning, we also feel that it is of crucial importance. And it has to be nurtured. I think it's very important that we don't take it for granted. That also needs constant dialogue. So, in order to conclude and to repeat, I think in this world we are now living, we really do need international cooperation. We need regional cooperation. We need bilateral contacts with the countries with whom we share the same values and norms and thinking. But also we need the dialogue with the countries with whom we differ in opinion and in systems, and that is the only way to build up the trust. Finland, my country, we are a small country with 5.5 million people up in the north of Europe. So we feel that we need others, but we hope that we can also contribute to the international discussion with our experience and with our knowledge and with our opinions in a constructive way. And as a final remark, I would like to actually echo my Dutch colleague who took up this morning a very important line, which I had already written down before listening to him. But really, I think what is important when we deal with cyber issues, that instead of thinking what we have today, we should think what we should know about tomorrow. So once again, we are never ready with this endeavor. So with these words, thanks.
Thank you, Pia. Yeah, never finished. Now, we have exactly 20 minutes left, so I think what we might do is just open up to the floor and take some questions if you guys are happy with that, and have a little bit of a more inclusive conversation. Does anyone have anything that they'd like to start off with? Someone coming forward? I've got lots of questions, but I'm going to wait in the queue.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Diane Steinauer with the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. We're part of the Department of Commerce. So I was very interested in the gentleman from the UAE in your remarks about regional cooperation. And I'm hoping maybe you can expand upon that. We talked this morning more about a global. I've had the pleasure of dealing with the ambassador on a regional basis with the United States on a formal basis. When you're talking about a regional model, is it because there's a shared culture or a shared economic level of activity or even shared infrastructure? So I'd be curious to know upon what grounds you think there's commonality and reason to move forward together. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So I think it's a combination of all of the different areas you talked about. It's first of all being geographically in a region, having similar history, similar culture, similar backgrounds, but also having similar concerns. So as you know, we live in a very difficult region. We have a lot going on around us. So dealing with our close neighbors and allies, creating a regional alliance, let's say. And we have that. We have in the Gulf, we have the Gulf Cooperation Council, which we use as a regional platform and a forum for the Gulf countries to discuss such topics. And there are other forums in the region. So there's the Arab Union, there's obviously European Union, there's the African Union, the ASEAN Association as well.
Okay, I'm just going to take the opportunity to ask you guys a question then. Saif, when you were talking about the kind of public-private partnership in the UAE and the way the government is working with the private sector. You talked about shared responsibility, and that's something that we hear a lot in that context, this idea that there is a shared responsibility. But I wanted to press you a bit on shared accountability rather than responsibility, because my understanding of the strategic document, the information assurance strategy that has been written, is that compliance with that is really binary. Either corporations are compliant or they're not compliant. And when Simone was talking about her experience, she, you indicated, Simone, that you felt that there was a necessity for some more clear incentives for the private sector to adhere to a kind of acceptable level of security. And I just sort of thought there's a bit of a tension there between, we're probably all familiar with these debates about whether to regulate or not regulate, and the dangers and the opportunities of both of those pathways. But I thought maybe it just came out quite clearly between your two presentations. Saif the UAE has this, very clear document about compliance, and from Simone's perspective, that's, that's a problem or a challenge in the private sector, is to kind of, incentivize compliance. And so I just wanted to see what you guys thought about each other's perspectives there.
Yeah, I'll take a start and play the unpopular opinion. I think in the private sector, it comes down to compliance is an important tool, and I don't think that by advocating for incentives, we're trying to say that there should not be compliance-based structures. But in all actuality, compliance-based frameworks in the United States, we have a number that have operated somewhat to that effect. There's ISO 27000 if you want to get really technical on the international scale, and those are all important compliance tools. But when you think about the core business that a lot of the private sector is trying to maintain and their economic concerns, business is all about the return on the investment. There is only limited amount you can spend on certain activities, and if those things are outweighed by the costs that they would take to have security, well, then there needs to be a decision that's made, and that's typically a business decision. And for that reason, I hate to say it, compliance ends up being just a check in the box. And so the reason I prefer to talk about incentives is that incentives are what really compel businesses, organizations, and people, because ultimately people make up all of these things, to really change their behaviors. Whereas compliance, I think, is typically seen as the first step towards those incentives, but often becomes very easy to come back and just sort of check the box.
Thank you.
Great.
Saif?
That's a great question. So I'll start by saying we at NISA, we're in a fairly unique position. As a government, as a federal government organization, we have the mandate not only to define the regulations, the policies and the standards, but also to ensure compliance. Now I'm talking about compliance for government and for critical infrastructure operators. So our main concern is government critical infrastructure, and with a focus primarily on national security. So we do have a audit and compliance framework which we recently developed, and our focus is to make sure that these critical organizations that impact every single citizen and resident in the country are compliant to these information assurance standards. So we do, when it comes to national security, unfortunately, we can't afford to take the incentive route. We have to make it clear what you need to be compliant with. However, that doesn't mean that we don't encourage and incentivize the private sector to also adopt these standards. So in a way, we kind of have a hybrid approach depending on where you sit within the country.
Really interesting. Any questions from our audience? Yes.
So I was very interested to hear the extent to which the government in Rwanda is electronic, but I hear it from other places. We talk about identifiability, we talk about security and accountability. So the question is, how do you ensure, what's your customer interface? How do they get into their services or whatever? How do you identify them? And how do you make sure that you're protecting their security?
Good question.
For everybody?
For you, I think, especially, yeah. And then maybe Pia as well.
How do you make sure what it
He's
is?
saying, so you have a very, Rwanda is very
Yes.
reliant on e-services.
Yes.
So do you have some, what's the action, how do people actually access them? Is there an interface, a program, an
Yes.
application? And how much are you able to protect their privacy when they do that?
The difference between what's happening in Rwanda with regard to ICT and probably other countries is that it's government-driven, so everything is centralized. You have, for example, the platform called Irembo, which is like a gate. That's where you access all government services, and everything is protected and driven by the government. So where you have constraints, for example, for new technology, in terms of regulation in countries like the US, you don't have similar constraints in Rwanda because it's all government driven. For example, right now, there's a US startup called Zipline that is making drones to deliver pharmaceuticals to remote parts of Rwanda. And it's something that is government driven that is going to be implemented very easily because if the government is the one that is initiating it, then it puts in place all those things that are required and the law and everything so much faster than if you have a startup that is a private company that is going to do something and then it has to go through the bureaucracy and all the loopholes of the legal loopholes that are required. So how you protect it, they've got the structural infrastructure that is based at the Rwanda Development Board, like I said, that does the protection against cyber attacks, and it works closely with the South Korean KISA and ITU as well. And then you have the EACO organization that is actually based in Kigali for the East African region. So they do have the protection measures already in place by the government. And you have also what they call the PKI, the public key infrastructure, that is also protecting against electronic transactions. So you do have protective measures. And also, because it's so central to development, there are all kinds of ICT plans that have been implemented by the government that have also included training engineers to have the capacity building. In Rwanda, you have the Niki plans and you have the master plan, the smart Rwanda plans. All those are government driven and they are so much faster, and you see so much innovation going into Rwanda right now with ICTs compared to everywhere else, simply because it's not been left to the private sector to drive the agenda. It's all government doing this. And they've also incentivized private sector to get involved by not taxing any of the ICT infrastructure coming into the country, including with regard to cybersecurity. Thank you.
It's really interesting to hear you say that it's so much faster by leaving it to the government. And in a way, it sort of takes us back to that period of the 70s in the US, really, doesn't it, where the government was funding and supporting the development of internet technology because there was no kind of private sector case for it. Pia, did you want to address that as well from a kind of Finnish perspective about the use of government services and the protecting privacy through those?
Well, very shortly, just that the as I referred to the human rights and the privacy and the issues online. I mean, they are very profoundly embedded in our legal system. So I mean that is something which nobody really questions. And of course, with the development of new technologies and needs to needs to be maybe more online also in order to safeguard the safety of the society. there's an ongoing debate, and that nothing really can't happen without really strictly following these basic principles of safeguarding
of human rights.
Yeah.
Great. If anyone else has a question, just come up. Otherwise, I'm going to keep working through my own questions, if that's okay. Simone, I wanted to ask you. About accountability in this kind of board level, because a lot of the work that CyberVista does, correct me if I'm wrong, is that they educate board members and senior executives on their responsibilities, right, in terms of cybersecurity. And I just thought it was very interesting that you do that, because there seems to be well, it's quite unusual, isn't it, for a CEO to actually take responsibility or situate themselves as accountable when we see these big breaches, these big data breaches. And there was that interesting case in the UK a few months ago where TalkTalk was, a mobile provider was hacked, and a lot of customer information was stolen. And it was quite unusual because the CEO of TalkTalk, this woman, Dita Harding, basically just came out and said, well, I hold myself accountable for that shouldn't have happened, and I'm the CEO. And she was kind of roasted at the time, but there was a really good op-ed by this academic at Royal Holloway, Keith Martin, who said, well, hang on a sec, isn't she supposed to be accountable? And shouldn't we be encouraging her to stand up and take, hold herself accountable for that data breach? But I don't think that we've seen that very often, certainly not in any of those big high-profile cases like the Sony case. I don't think anyone ever kind of stood up and said, yeah, I'm responsible.
I would respond by saying I think that that's changing and it's increasing. A number of the large breaches that have occurred in the U.S., typically it is the chief executive officer that ultimately is held accountable and typically loses his or her job as a result of the breach. We saw it, actually it wasn't in Sony Global, but Sony Entertainment, the CEO of Sony Entertainment did end up stepping down. We're also seeing a lot of accountability that is starting to be initiated from third-party shareholder and derivative lawsuits against boards of directors and some of the select C-suite, stating that they have breached their duties of loyalty, care, and good faith in actually overseeing and managing the ultimate business. And so I think, one of the reasons that we have focused so much on board and executive education is because that accountability comes down to how you manage your overall enterprise. And again, to reiterate what I said earlier, cyber is one component of that, and so you need to be responsible for the actions, cyber included, that could impact those parts of the business, just like you would be responsible for what currently happens in Sarbanes-Oxley. If you don't understand your financial situation, you're going to be held accountable to that. In the United States, the regulatory bodies haven't caught up to have the equivalent of a Sarbanes-Oxley for US-based companies. It is my opinion that might happen at some point in the future. I know that also in the United States there is a proposed bill that's currently on the floor from Senator Collins that is actually suggesting that there should be required cybersecurity expertise on each and every board of any company that operates in the United States. Whether that is ultimately a good idea to have all of that responsibility pinned on one person or the entire board, I think still remains to be seen. But I do think that underpins and underscores the importance that executives and boards are just as responsible for being literate and educated on this issue, just as the actual security operators, network operators, and IT administrators that are responsible for keeping the security of a network.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it kind of links in with James Comey's remarks earlier today, doesn't it, about this kind of incredible support for businesses in the U.S. From the FBI when they suffer a breach. But then, of course, that's very expensive support, isn't it? So, for a company like Sony that had a kind of questionable, or apparently, according to the papers, had a kind of questionable security kind of regime in the beginning, it's a lot of money to be putting into, and it raises those questions of accountability. Okay, I think just with the remaining time, I just ask the panelists to make a comment then, going back to the kind of overarching theme of this about what can we take away from these kind of individual cases of accountability practices? What can we take away from this when we think about the problem of accountability in international relations in the context of cybersecurity? And I'm going to just, basically put you both all on the spot and ask you, maybe beginning with you, Pia, what's your kind of take home then when we think about this problem of accountability in cyberspace? We think about the difficulties of state-based and potentially non-state-based accountability. What do you sort of see as maybe some of the places where we could be developing a little further?
I think really with the, I think that the key I keep repeating here is really that we build up the trust, and the trust you can only build, through cooperation and dialogue. So in a nutshell, I would just, to put it in a very simple phrase.
Thank you. Simone?
I think to me it comes down to the balance of accountability. So we spoke a bit, about incentives and what private companies and businesses are responsible for their own, agendas and ultimate goals, but there's also the national security and the government role. And to me, the question ultimately comes down to what is the balance between how much of that should be set by a government, a nation state, or some other regulatory body versus actually initiatives that private sector can also take on its own to be proactive. And I really think that there is a role for both, and it does come back to the dialogue and trust. I think the private sector needs to really understand what interests government is trying to protect in some of its attempts to regulate. But on the other side of the coin, I think that government needs to really take into account the interests that the private sector is looking to achieve, and some of the things that are actually self-incentivizing for the private sector. A private sector company does not want to lose their customers because they have poor security measures that could be potentially detrimental. They also don't want to be over-regulated so that they only kind of serve a compliance type of function. So to me, it really comes down to the word balance.
Thank you. Saif?
So from a national level, I would say, key takeaway is shared responsibility. Everybody needs to be aware of the risks. They need to know what's expected from them. They need to know what they need to do as individuals or as organizations in order to support their national vision. From an international point of view, I think getting these like-minded people talking together in smaller forums, agreeing on these norms, and stepping stones towards international agreement on what cyber norms are.
Thank you. In Florida?
I agree with Pia and Saif in that you have to do it through cooperation, but first you clear your house nationally, then you go regional, and then you go international. And it's the only way of protecting the cyberspace, because we share it, and there's no way out unless we dialogue and understand that there are high stakes that have to be dealt with in case we don't cooperate and share information.
Okay, so these kind of very social factors, right, of trust, of balance, of shared responsibility, which I guess, essentially brings us back to Hedley Bull's anarchic society. We live in this kind of anarchical environment, and yet we are capable of socializing and cooperating around shared interests and shared security concerns. And the challenge, I suppose, is being able to articulate what we share in that space and where we differ, and being able to accommodate difference and being able to identify common concerns. So yes, I'm not sure that we solved our, our problem, but I think we came a long way today. So I'd like you to all thank our four very, very good presenters. Thank you.